anthology on the bad, the short-lived, and the forgotten shows and events in television history. This is It Was a Thing on TV.
C would write poetry, believe it or not. Therefore, our continuing champions are the Hunts with 300 with how many points, I don't know.
Episode 512, submission number 2404, Dan August. Dan August aired on ABC from September 23rd of 1970 to April 8th of 1971 for 26 episodes.
Dan August. A Quinn Martin production. Starring Burt Reynolds. Also starring Norman Fell, Richard Anderson, Ned Romero, Ina Hartman. With guest stars Diana Muldaur, Bird Benning, Roger Perry, and special guest star Anne Francis. Tonight's episode, Murder by Proxy.
Well, we're going to talk about
A Quinn Martin production.
We talked about A Man Called Sloan. That was actually Quinn Martin's final television show, even though it wasn't the last Quinn Martin show to air a new episode. Barnaby Jones, its final episode aired, I believe, March of 1980, and A Man Called Sloan ended December of 1979. But we're not here to talk about A Man Called Sloan or Barnaby Jones. We're going to go back almost a decade before. And I think this is one of Quinn Martin's first detective shows. We know him as the man behind Cannon, The Streets of San Francisco, as I said, Barnaby Jones, and numerous other crime dramas. But I believe the first, at least in terms of modern times, after the FBI, is Dan August. What you see is what you get. It's just a crime drama, police procedural, but you have Dan August, a police lieutenant, investigating homicides. And he does it in his hometown of Santa Luisa, California, which is fictional. And just like all the other police dramas, specifically I'm going to say Quinn Martin shows, you have a sidekick. Barnaby Jones, you had Lee Merriweather. Cannon really didn't have a sidekick on his own, per se. He just did it himself, because he's an absolute legend. But Dan August, his sidekick is Sergeant Charlie Willens. Again, the basic plot of the show is just straightforward police procedural, crime drama. He doesn't do anything special, not from the episodes I've seen. So it's a very basic layout of the show. But I think the thing we really need to get into is who's on the show. There's a couple of names that are really huge. The biggest name is definitely the lead, Lieutenant Dan August, played by a person that wasn't really that big in 1970. Give him about 7 or 8 years, and he'll be the biggest star on the planet. But even if you just wait 2 years, a little film called Deliverance is going to put him on the map. We're talking about Burt Reynolds. Beyond Dan August and Deliverance and Smokey and the Bandit, we could be here forever and a day talking about what Burt Reynolds has done. Even on the production side, talking about Burt and Burt Productions, Win, Lose, or Draw, he did it all. An absolute legend. I should also add, I can't believe I'm doing this. He played the congressman in the 1996 cinematic classic with Demi Moore, Striptease.
Oh, and it's current now because Demi Moore's getting all that praise for The Substance.
I'm sorry, I've seen Striptease. Oh my gosh. Burt Reynolds must have been very desperate when he took that role. I almost feel bad for him. That's what I get for looking at his IMDb, and it has here, known for Striptease. Oh no. Give me Showgirls any day of the week, but Striptease. Oh, I don't know what Demi Moore was thinking. That was just a piece of crap. But also, Burt Reynolds, he definitely had a card in Americana, at least Series 1, because, not even joking, first pack of Americana that I opened back in 2007, I pulled out a Burt Reynolds autographed swatch card numbered to 25. And that's the moment I fell in love with Americana, because I pulled a frigging Burt Reynolds autograph card. That's how they get you. First pack, oh, Burt Reynolds. Holy crap, this is cool. And you just suddenly send all your money to Panini because you don't care about money. Boy, it's starting to sound like Greg there, with all due respect. Playing Dan August's partner, Sergeant Charles Wylance, somebody you would not normally associate with a drama. Norman Fell. Stanley Roper himself. I think that's just absolutely amazing. Playing Chief George Untermeyer, we've talked about this person in the past. Richard Anderson, not Richard Dean Anderson, but Richard Anderson, best known as Oscar Goldman on the $6 Man. Ha ha ha! Best known as Oscar Goldman on 99 episodes of The $6 Million Man. Oh, and that's staying in, by the way. I'm sorry. That was a great little mistake I made there. The $6 Man.
The $6 Man's the Timu version of the $6 billion Man.
Well, no. If you remember Uncle Croc's Block, one of the characters that occasionally appeared was the $6.75 man. Am I the only person who is willing to admit remembering Uncle Croc's Block around here?
Yes.
Yes.
And the thing is, the $6.75 man was played by... Oh, I can't believe I'm saying this. Robert Ridgely, the game show host on the game show episode of Night Court. I am human sweat.
I want to be your love slave.
I'm glad you said that, not me. But going back to Richard Anderson, beyond the $6 Million Man, he was the narrator and Captain Styles on Kung Fu: The Legend Continues. But also, he had a card in Americana. I don't remember if it was Series 1 or Series 2, but that's another card that I have in my collection. I have a Richard Anderson autograph card. So I have two people who are on Dan August. And one of them is not Norman Fell because he passed away 8 years before Americana was even a thing. Playing Sergeant Joe Rivera is Ned Romero. Maybe not the biggest or best name. If you believe IMDb, he was also on, well, since we just talked about it, $6 Million Man for 2 episodes. Final character who appeared on all 26 episodes, playing Katie Grant, is Ina Hartman. Ina Hartman, well, let's just say that Dan August is on her best known for on IMDb, so that's usually a sign that you didn't have much of a career. And taking a look at her IMDb, yeah, that's about the extent of her career. Her first role was in a 1964 episode of Bonanza, and her last role was on a 1975 episode of Police Story. Besides Dan August, the most number of episodes she was on for any one series was she was on 3 episodes of Ironside. So those are our 5 main characters. We've got 26 episodes to go through. Let's jump right into it. Starting with episode 1, Murder by Proxy. I mean, even just for starters, Murder by Proxy, that sounds like the title of a Quinn Martin show. If you've ever seen Streets of San Francisco or Cannon or Barnaby Jones, it just sounds like a title Quinn Martin would give to a show. Murder by Proxy. A well-known race car driver is driving recklessly and at a very high speed. When a police car gives chase, Gabe Redfern loses control and drives into the lake. First officer on the scene finds that the driver is naked and that he has been shot. Dan August knew the race car driver personally. He suspects that the killer is someone close to Gabe, but everyone has an alibi. Good heavens, is this a great way to start a show? Playing Elizabeth, the one and only Diana Muldaur from LA Law. Play it.
I really don't want to talk about it.
Oh my God!
Not a Pulaski episode.
We just love Diana Muldaur around here.
Do we, though?
Well, we do because we keep on bringing her up. Whenever we see her or talk about LA Law, you get that clip of her falling down the elevator shaft. I think that's the ultimate sign of respect. I could be entirely wrong, but I think it's a sign of respect. Beyond that, playing Nina Porter in this episode is Anne Francis, Honey West herself. That's a pretty stacked lineup for episode 1. I can't wait to see who we have for episode 2. I can't wait to see what the title of episode 2 is, if it's a real Quinn Martin show. Episode 2 is The Murder of a Small Town. A sabotaged school bus is involved in an accident that kills Rivera's niece. Dan wonders if a migrant workers' strike is connected and must find the killer before violence breaks out. I don't know if this is the baddie in the episode, but I wouldn't be surprised if this guy is the bad guy. Playing Manuel Acaba in this episode is Ricardo Montalban.
That does sound like a bad guy's name.
Well, not just that, but Ricardo Montalban being the baddie. I think that's perfect. But yeah, that name, Manuel Acaba, might be a bad guy. Well, actually, I wonder if he may be somebody connected to that migrant workers' strike. Who knows? Episode 3 is titled Love is a Nickel Bag. Yeah, now it's starting to sound like episode titles from Quinn Martin shows. Love is a nickel bag. A teenage boy fatally overdoses at a wild party. In order to find the drug supplier, Dan sweats out the heroin-addicted host of the party in an attempt to gain information. Oh my, yes, this is starting to sound like a Quinn Martin show. Maybe we're seeing the genesis of like the Quinn Martin crime drama on Dan August, between the episode title names and some of these plot lines. That'll take us to episode 4, entitled The King is Dead. The philanthropist who put Dan through college is found shot to death, and Dan doesn't buy the scared burglar theory. I don't know if this is the philanthropist who gets shot to death or if this is somebody else that has a prominent role in this episode. I'm going to guess yes, because when you look at the credits on IMDb, generally like the regulars are first, and then mainly you've got the bigger characters right below the main characters. This guy's right below the main characters, playing Rick Bessett. Just lost him earlier this year. Dabney Coleman. Where could we start? 9 to 5. We could talk about Buffalo Bill, which we covered within the last year, I believe. We could talk about Mary Hartman, where he was the mayor. And we could also add, since it's one of my favorite movies from the early to mid 80s, Cloak and Dagger. But yeah, we just lost him, I think maybe about 8 months ago or so. One more name, not a big name, but one more name I want to add, who played Thelma Venable in this episode, is Janice Rule. Only reason I'm mentioning her is she has made numerous appearances on other Quinn Martin TV shows. I remember the name from just watching episodes on MeTV of Cannon and Barnaby Jones. In terms of Quinn Martin shows, she was on episodes of The Streets of San Francisco and Banyan and Barnaby Jones. So definitely somebody in the Quinn Martin Rolodex. Episode 5 is titled In the Eyes of God. Dan and the department must investigate a murder at a church, and a former priest is the prime suspect because he refuses to reveal everything he knows about what happened. Another person that sort of falls under the Janice Rule category of somebody who I've seen on a number of Quinn Martin shows plays Matthew Costa in this episode, talking about Bradford Dillman. Not really known for being on a particular show. He did 10 episodes of Falcon Crest in the 1982-83 season. He was on King's Crossing. But again, he's another person who I have seen as a guest on numerous Quinn Martin television shows, including Cannon, The Streets of San Francisco, and Barnaby Jones. So again, another person who's probably in Quinn Martin's Rolodex. But we got a bigger, more well-known name playing Edna Adams in this episode is Donna Mills. Abby Ewing on Knots Landing. So definitely a known entity in that role.
And also, Knots Landing is airing on the Primetime Soaps channel on Plex.
Did not know that.
I did not know that.
One more name. Playing Wiley in this episode, James Best, Sheriff Roscoe P. Coltrane from The Dukes of Hazzard.
Episode 6 is entitled The Color of Fury. Dan tries to help a black activist accused of the murder of a councilman's sister. I don't know if this person is the black activist accused of murder in this episode, but playing Jimmy Barlow is Raymond St. Jacques. I best know him as one of the judges on the courtroom show from the late 80s, Superior Court. Don't tell me you guys don't remember Superior Court.
I remember Superior Court. I remember it being like the sort of complement of the People's Court, except where the People's Court is real, Superior Court is fictional.
No, beyond that. People's Court is people fighting over hamburgers and car accidents and little things. Superior Court was like big lawsuits, $1 million lawsuits. I think even like murders and stuff like that. There's very little connection between the People's Court and Superior Court outside of the word court.
So Edwards and Billett didn't produce it? Because I thought they did.
Now, I didn't imply that. I was just saying People's Court is real and is small potatoes compared to Superior Court, which was like real big cases. Even though it was fictionalized, yeah, there was like, $1 million deals at stake. And I remember it being not just like a People's Court type of show. It was big. But it was all, again, as you said, not fake, but it was scripted.
Another name in this episode, playing Mr. Gant, Michael Warren from Hill Street.
So he was with Dennis Franz before Bunce went to Beverly Hills, I presume.
That's about the size of it, my friend.
Episode 7 is titled Invitation to Murder. There's a good title for a Quinn Martin show. Invitation to Murder. The spoiled brat of a daughter of a famous newspaper columnist is found dead on the beach. Dan's investigation is complicated by the columnist who uses his forum to virtually convict the girl's hippie boyfriend. Oh, it is the early 70s, so we're going to have hippie boyfriends. In this episode, playing Max Winslow is Tim O'Connor. He played Dr. Hewer in Buck Rogers in the 25th Century, not Duck Dodgers in the 24th and a half century. I'm sorry, I just wanted to say Duck Dodgers. 11:30 p.m. on Saturdays on MeTV Tunes. Go watch it. Episode 8 is titled The Union Forever. A union leader is assassinated, and his rival, who has a police record, is suspected of setting him up to be killed. We have a lot of names in this episode. First, playing Steve Harrison is Vic Morrow. He played Sergeant Saunders on Combat, but I think he's best known, unfortunately, for his ultimate demise in Twilight Zone, the movie. And I'm talking about ultimate demise in real life, not acting terms.
Yes.
Yeah, just to clarify for those people who think, oh, his character died in Twilight Zone, the movie. No, he actually died in the production of Twilight Zone, the movie. Playing Terry Young is Andrew Prine. He's been around, maybe that guy from that show, but where I know him best, and again, I'm going to try to say this with a straight face, he was Psycho Dad on Married with Children. Is the silence just utter shock that there is actually somebody who played Psycho Dad on Married with Children?
The other shock is you actually said that with a straight face.
It was tough to do, but that's where I know Andrew Prine from. He was Psycho Dad, albeit it was like one episode, maybe two, where he called out Al for basically going to Congress because Psycho Dad was removed off the schedule. He went all the way to Congress to fight for Psycho Dad to go back on the air. So literally, he was probably on TV for a minute, but that's the role I know him from. Psycho Dad in one episode, or maybe two episodes, but no more than like 2 minutes of screen time as Psycho Dad. End of story. Clara Diggin in this episode is played by Joan Van Ark. I think we all know where Joan Van Ark is from. Yet another person who was on Knots Landing. Val Ewing. Episode 9, and again, episode title that sounds just like a Quinn Martin production. Epitaph for a Swinger. Dan checks out the residents of a swingers apartment complex after a gigolo is murdered. I'm sorry, I'm not laughing at the murder. Just everybody gets murdered in this series, and this one happens to be at a swingers apartment, and a gigolo's murdered. Oh, I can't wait to see who is the gigolo in this episode, if it's anybody recognizable. And I don't think it's anybody recognizable. Episode 10 is titled When the Shouting Dies. Boy, I wonder if the shouting died when the person died. Let's find out. A beautiful blackmailer dies in a fall from an apartment balcony, and the prime suspect is Dan's old friend, Heap Canfield. Oh, please. I hope the beautiful blackmailer who died is Diana Muldaur. That would be so epic. She died in an elevator shaft, and she died being pushed off of an apartment balcony. Please, please, please. Oh, darn, she's not. But playing Art Bowman in this episode, not Heap Canfield, the friend, playing Art Bowman, one of our favorites, Victor French. No, Victor French did not wear an Oakland A's hat in the filming of this episode. One more name in this episode playing Hobbs is Rance Howard, Ron Howard's daddy, Clint Howard's daddy, Bryce Dallas Howard's granddaddy. Pretty big name in the entertainment business, and we've talked about him numerous times in the past. That will take us to episode 11, titled The Soldier. Dan's attempt to clear an AWOL soldier of an MP's murder is hampered by the suspect's uncooperative friends. In this episode, we have a person named Charity. Interesting name. But Charity is played by, I think, a legend, Hal Williams from 227 and Sanford and Son, where he played Officer Smitty. Smitty and Hoppy were the best parts of Sanford and Son. I'm sorry. Just got to get that off my chest. Yeah, I love Fred Sanford and Lamont and all that, but Smitty and Hoppy are just absolutely hilarious together.
Playing a character by the name of Mike Foshke, Michael Ontkeen from Twin Peaks.
Yes, because he played Sheriff Truman on Twin Peaks, but he was also in the 1977 Paul Newman classic, Slapshot. Have you seen Slapshot, Mike?
I have not, believe it or not.
Oh, you have to see it. It's a classic.
Oh, I know I do. I know it's a great movie. I just have never seen it. Episode 12 is entitled Quadrangle for Death. Good heavens, now they're putting geometry in this. Quadrangle for Death. A college president who just fired a controversial professor is run down in a campus parking lot. The professor preaches resisting authority in the classroom and tells August he'll not cooperate with the investigation, and any attempt to harass him will result in campus violence. Pretty big topic at the time, because if you think about it, 1970, that's when the whole Kent State situation happened. Albeit not because of a professor being murdered, something a little bit bigger than that, but still kind of timely if you think about it. Playing who I assume is the controversial professor, Professor Theodore Rye, is Richard Basehart. I know we've talked about him in the past. The name sounds familiar, but he is probably best known for playing Admiral Nelson on 110 episodes of Voyage to the Bottom of the Sea. And also, he was the narrator on Knight Rider. We did talk about Richard Basehart previously. He appeared on an episode of Mr. Merlin. We have another name, and I assume, given how old this person would have been in 1970, he probably played one of the college students. Playing Coley Smith is John Ritter. Jack Tripper.
Yeah, give it another 7 years. You can come knock on his door.
He's been waiting for you.
Where the kisses are hers and hers. Three's
And
Company
his.
too.
And his, yeah, and his. Three's Company too.
Yeah.
Do. Did we just do the first verse of the Three's Company theme somehow? We sort of piecemealed it together.
And Joe Raposo would be so proud.
That's a lie, but whatever. Episode 13 is Passing Fair. A missing file from a murdered psychiatrist's office is the key to solving both the doctor's murder and a blackmail plot. Episode 14 is titled The Titan. Dan deals with a millionaire, his wife, and his right-hand man, all suspects in the murder of a low-level drug pusher. Playing William Britton, who I'm going to guess is the millionaire, is Robert Fuller, who would later star on Emergency, which you can see on MeTV 5 p.m. weekdays. Problem is you won't see it at 5 p.m. weekdays in my house because The Streets of San Francisco is on at that time on MeTV Plus, and it's the Tom and Jerry show on MeTV Tunes. So, sorry, Emergency. Sorry, Robert Fuller. In this episode, playing Pete Killian is Barry Sullivan. He's another one of those people who made the rounds on Quinn Martin shows. He was on Cannon, the original Cannon movie, believe it or not, but also a regular episode of Cannon, and The Streets of San Francisco, and Barnaby Jones. So another one of the people in Quinn Martin's Rolodex. Episode 15 is titled Death Chain. One murder leads to more killing. Dan's initial investigation is the rape and murder of a young, recently divorced socialite, but as he looks into the case, a mysterious sniper is picking off the suspects, all young men she was last seen with. Dan must now not only search for the sniper, but whomever it was that tipped him off. Dominic Lazard in this episode is played by Gerald S. O'Laughlin. I know we've talked about him in the past. His name rings a bell. He played Lieutenant Riker on The Rookies, another show which actually airs at 4 p.m. on MeTV Plus before The Streets of San Francisco. We did talk about him because he played Captain E.G. Boyd on 13 episodes of Automan. But also he was on an episode of The Powers of Matthew Starr. So we've definitely talked about him in a couple of places, for better or for worse. But a bigger name, playing Kevin Coulter in this episode. Again, gonna assume, based on his age at this point, he was probably one of the people who was murdered by this socialite. Jan Michael Vincent from Airwolf. And actually another name I'm going to throw out, again, probably of the age of a college student, So probably another victim of the socialite. Somebody we've talked about quite a bit. His name in this episode is Ron. He was played by Michael Lembeck from One Day at a Time, but also Michael Lembeck, I believe, was on 2 weeks of Match Game Hollywood Squares Hour. One more name I want to add, and this person definitely would not have been a young person killed by a socialite. He was not in his 20s or early 30s at this point of his life. Playing Mr. Stedman, another name we've talked about in the past, Ivan Bonar. We talked about it on the Colbys. He played Henderson Palmer. Let's go to episode 16, which is titled Dead Witness to a Killing. An assistant DA refuses to cooperate with Dan, who is looking into the murder of the lawyer's wife. This is the second straight episode we've talked about this guy. This guy's been popping up on a lot of episodes as of late. Playing Frank Devlin is Monty Markham. We just talked about him last episode on A Man Called Sloan. He was Harry Mason in the early 70s reboot Harry Mason, the one that had Brett Summers as, I think, a secretary for Perry Mason in that series. But a much bigger name. Playing Norman Sayles, Martin Sheen. We do actually have one more name. Not a big, well, you know what? This is tough to say, but he was a big name. Now he's just a Mr. Black. Playing an uncredited doctor in this episode is Stephen Collins. All we're going to say is he was on Seventh Heaven, and that's it. You could do your own research if you don't know about his history. Quoting a famous gentleman, I believe by the name of Chico Alexander. I hope I get this right, Chico. He a bad man.
Yeah, bad man.
I got the phrase right. I just didn't have the proper accent there. Didn't have the appropriate stress.
He no good. No bueno.
He definitely no good, no bueno. He a bad man. Like I said, we're not going to go any deeper into it. You just remember him from Seventh Heaven, and hopefully the only thing you remember him from is Seventh Heaven. Moving quickly to episode 17, the title of which is The Law. Retired Judge Anderson lives with his daughter and son-in-law. The judge, who may be suffering from early onset Alzheimer's disease, is increasingly paranoid and tormented. One day, the daughter asks the son-in-law to take the judge for a drive. Both agree. As the son-in-law drives through the open country with the judge in the back seat, they notice a car behind them getting ready to pass. The son-in-law slows down. As the car comes alongside, the judge suddenly whips out a revolver and fires 3 times point blank through the window. The other car careens wildly into a field, tearing up grass and small trees before it comes to rest against the stump of a huge ancient tree struck by lightning years earlier. The incredulous son-in-law drives to the nearest town and calls for help. Dan August and his crew come out and find the driver of the other car dead from the judge's bullets. The judge admits to sneaking the gun because he was sure he was going to get whacked, and firing at the other car in self-defense. But the dead driver is unarmed and there is no gun in his car or on the ground nearby. Almost everyone assumes that the judge has completely lost his mind and will spend the rest of his life in an institution for the criminally insane. He doesn't get that far, dying by hanging at the end of Act 3. But August realizes someone did have something to gain by the judge's death and launches a new search for the gun. When he finds it in the dead tree, he realizes the judge was murdered after all and starts hunting for the killer. Oh, we got names in this episode. I see 2 big names. Maybe a third. Playing Art Lewis in this episode, Larry Hagman from Dallas and I Dream of Jeannie. J.R. Ewing. What else do we need to say? Playing Miranda Lewis, who I'm going to guess is his wife in this episode. Again, staying in the Quinn Martin family, Lee Merriweather from Barnaby Jones, among other things. The judge in this episode, Judge Anderson, is played by Walter Pidgeon, not really known necessarily for any one role, but he goes way back. His first role, according to IMDb, was in the 1926 movie Mannequin. No, Greg, not that Mannequin. I'm sorry, Kim Cattrall was not around in 1926.
Oh, darn.
I wanted to break it to you very slowly. I didn't want you flipping out. Episode 18 is titled The Worst Crime. I think we've seen all the worst crimes in the previous 17 episodes. Murder. Maybe there's a worse murder. Who knows? After a young waitress is brutally raped and killed in a city park, Dan orders a roundup of all known sex offenders in the area. When a second body is found nearby, that of a young housewife who apparently died in a car accident, he wonders whether the waitress saw something she shouldn't have seen. Again, we've got numerous names in this episode. Starting off with Mort Downs, he was played by Sal Mineo. He was in Rebel Without a Cause. So he was in a James Dean movie. But definitely a known entity from the 50s and 60s, Sal Mineo. A bigger name playing Tony Storm in this episode is Fernando Lamas. So we're talking Lorenzo's daddy.
And playing Agnes Oakes in this episode, Ellen Corby, Esther Walton from The Waltons, the grandma.
That'll take us to episode 19, which is titled Circle of Lies. A hot-tempered automobile designer is accused of killing his boss after being fired. Moving on to episode 20, which is titled Track Down. Dan pursues a gang of racetrack robbers after a patrolman friend of his is gunned down. In this episode, playing Eddie Downs, another person we just mentioned last episode, a man called Sloan, Michael Pataki. And as we mentioned in the previous episode, Michael Pataki was the ring man for Ivan Drago in Rocky IV. Moving on to episode 21, which is titled Bullet for a Hero. Dan wonders if the murder of a soldier who recently returned from Vietnam has anything to do with his marriage to a Vietnamese girl. You can't say the show's not timely. Lieutenant Pete O'Connell in this episode is played by one of our favorites, Chris Pine's daddy, Robert Pine. We're in the home stretch, only a few more episodes to go. Episode 22 is titled The Manufactured Man. The political arena forms the background for Dan's investigation into the brutal murder of a young campaign worker. Among the suspects are the candidate, his son, a reporter, and a couple of the candidate's aides. Many names in this episode. We'll start off with, I'm going to guess this may be the politician, the candidate. Kenny O'Malley, played by Mickey Rooney. I think that's all we need to say. Legendary Mickey Rooney. The second person in this episode, based on his age, I'm going to assume is possibly a candidate's aide. Lawrence Merrill III, played by the recently departed David Soul. But the names go on and on. We got a few more names here, believe it or not. This is a stacked episode. Playing Steve McAdams is Billy D. Williams.
Lando Calrissian.
That's all you need to say. Absolutely. But moving on. Again, big names. Playing hippie number 2. Not hippie number 1. Hippie number 2. And I think, Greg, we've talked about this in the past. The number 2s on these shows always become more popular because we talked about Tiffany Haddish's stripper number 2 on that episode of It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia. But hippie number 2, compared to hippie number 1, has had a big career. And we've talked about him in the past because he delivered some pet justice. Gary Busey. Pet justice. Oh, that's great.
Not to take anything away from hippie number 1, who is actually played by Anthony Geary.
Yes! Luke Spencer.
But Anthony Geary is not Gary Busey.
I know that, but he's still Luke Spencer.
I'll give you that.
And he was in UHF. Let's not forget that.
But did Anthony Geary deliver any pet justice? No. Case closed. I win. Okay, so there's 5 people, but believe it or not, we have a 6th. And this is the biggest star of all. Playing Hewitt. How about Harrison Ford? Like I said, the biggest name of 6 legitimate guest stars in this episode. This is like a 20 canon episode. I'm sorry, guys. I'm making a whole new system for measuring these episodes. This is 20 friggin' cannons. I can't limit this lineup to 5 cannons.
No, I have even better. 50 cannons.
That's a lot of cannons.
I'm not debating it. 50 is a justifiable answer. This is a stacked episode. I mean, seriously, when the third most popular person on this episode is Billy D. freaking Williams, that's a big episode.
So you have Han and you have Lando.
You do have a good point there. Episode 23 is entitled The Meal Ticket. A young boxer suddenly drops dead in the 3rd round. The autopsy shows an overdose of methamphetamine. Dan August is determined to find the person who drugged out the boxer. I don't know if this is the boxer, but this is definitely somebody we've talked about in the past. Well, this doesn't sound like a boxing name. I'm sorry. This sounds like a wrestling name. Playing Nick Rude. I'm sorry. I just see him like wrestling in the WWE as a heel. Nick Rude.
He's ravishing Rick Rude's younger brother. Keep the noise down while I show the ladies what a real man looks like. Hit the music.
Rick Rude and Nick Rude. Oh my gosh. That's good. So Nick Rude in this episode is played by Don Stroud. We have definitely talked about him in the past. I'm sorry, now I've got Rick Rude in my head. Thank you, Greg. Where we've talked about Don Stroud in the past, he was on an episode of The Powers of Matthew Starr. It always goes back to The Powers of Matthew Starr. I don't get it. But he also, and this is probably where we really remember him, he played Sergeant Varick on Mrs. Columbo. Kate Loves a Mystery. And he was on an episode of Supertrain. That's where we talked about him recently when we did Supertrain Revisited. So maybe a slight low-key Hall of Fame case? But by no means is he the only name in this episode. We actually have a few more names. First, playing Maury Abrams is Simon Oakland. We talked about Simon Oakland in the past. He played Tony Vincenzo on Kolchak the Night Stalker. But in addition, he was Major General Thomas More on Baba Black Sheep. This has got to be about the 4th or 5th time we talked about Baba Black Sheep just this week. A lot of people from the 70s were on Baba Black Sheep. Go figure. Playing just a kid at the gym. That's the name. No proper name. Kid at the gym. Again, somebody we've talked about in the past in maybe a weird way, but still somebody I'm going to bring up. Ira Angustain. He was on The White Shadow, Ricky Gomez. We've talked about Iris Angustain twice previously. He was on an episode of Whiz Kids, but also, and I can't believe I'm bringing this up, and I can't wait for the reaction from Greg and Chico to what I'm going to say because I pulled this out of a certain crevice in my body. Iris Angustain was on a week of Celebrity Beat the Clock in 1979/1980. Aren't you impressed?
Yes.
No, just say no. Just be honest and say no.
I was just wondering, is this one of the episodes that gave you closure?
No, Ira Angustain, he wasn't on the final week, but I think he was on the second to last week. No, actually, it looks like he was maybe about like the 4th or 5th to the last week, because he was on, looks like the first full week of 1980. So maybe a month or maybe even less than a month before Beat the Clock's cancellation. I can't believe I made a reference to Beat the Clock in 1980 using Ira Angustain of all people. But hey, we got a name even bigger than Ira Angustain, believe it or not. I mean, I think the janitor on this episode was bigger than Ira Angustain, but we're not going to talk about him. We're going to talk about the boxing announcer. We actually talked about him in a series that happened in 1970 back in February. Where's Huddles? Because he was the football announcer on every episode of Where's Huddles. The boxing announcer in this episode is Dick Enberg, legendary play-by-play announcer. I don't even know where to start. We could talk about Sports Challenge. We could talk about him doing San Diego Padres games for seemingly ever. Just an absolute legend in the world of announcing.
And let's not forget him calling NFL games with Merlin Olsen.
Oh, absolutely. 3 more episodes to go. Episode 24 is titled Days of Rage. Dan catches up to a radical wanted for killing a cop, but the man is killed by a sniper before Dan can make the arrest. The question is, was it someone else in his radical group who fired the fatal shot? Or was it the millionaire husband of the dead man's lover? Or could it have been someone totally unexpected? Playing Phyllis Hendricks in this episode is Diana Hyland. Diana Hyland was Joan Bradford on 8 is Enough. Only for 4 episodes, but that's because she passed away at the age of 41 in 1977. So she was barely on that series. She was better known probably for being Susan Winter on 59 episodes of Peyton Place, a landmark series from the late 60s. But by no means is she the only known person on this show. Playing Rudy's girlfriend, that's simply her name, Rudy's girlfriend, is Jonelle Allen. Among Jonelle Allen's roles is she played Grace on 107 episodes of Dr. Quinn Medicine Woman. But also she was definitely a known entity in the game show world, specifically in the late 70s, early 80s, because I know she did at least a week of Match Game back in the early 80s, but also I know she did a couple of weeks of Body Language in 1985. Second to last episode is entitled Prognosis Homicide. A surgeon receives a gift of a bottle of whiskey, which he doesn't need, so he passes it on to a couple of nearby winos who die from drinking the poisoned spirits inside the bottle. The question is, who's out to kill the surgeon? And Dan gets no help from the uncooperative doctor. Nearby winos died from drinking poisoned whiskey. That's clever, but also at the same time, that's kind of weird. That will take us to the final episode, The Assassin. Sniper fires upon Chief Untermeyer and a friend of his whom he'd been visiting, wounding him and killing her. Dan is led to a couple of suspects, an embezzling employee of her company who is quickly dismissed as a suspect, her grandson whose only concern seems to be inheriting the old lady's money, and her mysterious boarder who harbors a deadly secret that he may be willing to kill to keep quiet. This sounds like a really good final episode just based on that synopsis. Some names in this episode. Good heavens, they came through with some big names in this series. Playing Larry Edwards is Gary Collins, Mr. Marianne Mobley. Also, I think we should say Mr. Our Magazine. Playing Steve Phipps in this episode is John Beck, not the backup quarterback for the Miami Dolphins like 17 years ago that Greg has referred to a number of times. This John Beck played Buzz Buchanan. I'm going to guess Mitch Buchanan's father, maybe? On Baywatch. Maybe not father, looking at his age. He's 80 now, so go back 30, 35 years. That would make him 45. So I don't think he's Mitch Buchanan's father. He may be Mitch Buchanan's brother. We have talked about John Beck in the past. Maybe this is where Greg referenced John Beck, the quarterback. John Beck was in one episode of Half Nelson. We do have another person in this episode playing Margot, no last name, just Margot, is Carolyn Jones, Morticia Adams herself. So that's 26 episodes, and that's the series. So what happened? I think taking a look at the schedule and taking a look at the ratings, will paint a very clear picture as to what happened. To begin with, Dan August aired on Wednesday nights at 10 p.m. On CBS at that time, it looks like it was the second hour of a movie. What's on NBC, though, interestingly enough, may have caused the downfall. It's something called 4 in 1. And you're probably saying to yourself, what is 4 in 1? It was like the mystery movie where you had McMillan and Wife and McCloud and Columbo and all the other mystery movies. It was the predecessor to that. It was an hour-long rotation of 4 shows. McCloud, a show called San Francisco International Airport, a show called The Psychiatrist, and Night Gallery. San Francisco International Airport and Psychiatrist only lasted the 1 season, but McCloud, it became part of the NBC mystery movie family, and Night Gallery, it had life after this 4 in 1 rotation of TV shows in 1970 and 71. So maybe that's why it lost in the ratings. Dan August stayed in that 10 to 11 p.m. time slot on Wednesdays until 1971. Then it moved to Thursdays at 9:30 p.m. So it ran from 9:30 to 10:30 p.m. Very interesting. Again on CBS, it went up against the second and third half hours of a movie. Kind of weird to say that, but that's really the best way of phrasing it. It was a 2-hour movie that started at 9. Dan August ran from 9:30 to 10:30. You're not beating what was on NBC at this point. 9:30 was Adam 12. I'm sorry, I should say one of my new shows that I enjoy watching getting ready for work, Adam 12. And actually, I think they're in 1971 right now on MeTV. But yeah, you're not beating Adam 12. That lasted until 75. But at 10 p.m., the first half hour of the Dean Martin Show, you're just not beating Adam 12 and Dean Martin. I'm sorry. Now, if we take a look at the ratings, I have some weeks of ratings, and it's not good. I have ratings from mid to late October of 1970, and out of 80 shows in this week, Dan August finished 78th, third from the bottom. And interestingly enough, one of the 2 shows that Dan August beat, believe it or not, is still on nowadays. We talked about this in a recent episode, the ratings woes of 60 Minutes. 60 Minutes was the second worst rated show on television in this week of October 1970. Yet it's still on almost 55 years later. Ponder that one.
Well, that's because they got that NFL lead in when they moved to Sundays.
Well, yeah, we did talk about that. You're absolutely right about that. If we go back 2 weeks earlier, so we're talking early-ish October of 1970, out of 81 shows, Dan August was 77th. So 5th from the bottom. And dead last that week was 60 Minutes. That boost created by the NFL airing into 60 Minutes, that's a real thing. Even back in 72, 73. It just amazes me that 60 Minutes survived after, 4 years of having low ratings? It started in 68. I haven't seen the ratings for 68 through 69-70 season, but still, multiple times we've seen it right at the bottom of the ratings in early 70, 71, 72.
And it's also amazing CBS and 60 Minutes managed to survive 4 years when they didn't have the NFL before they got it back in 98.
Valid point, but also at that point, I think 60 Minutes had become sort of a legacy series because it would have been on over 25, almost 30 years at that point. But still, valid point. One thing I wanted to add about 60 Minutes, and I know we usually don't promote other podcasts, but 60 Minutes just started a podcast about some of their old stories and sort of catching up with them because they've covered stories from 68 and 69, 70, 71, 74, 75. I think it's an absolutely fascinating podcast. It's called The Second Look, or maybe 60 Minutes a Second Look. Go check it out. It's very informational, very educational, very entertaining. Okay, now I'm waiting for them to promote our podcast. We did our part 60 minutes. Now you got to promote It Was a Thing on TV. We're waiting. I think we're going to have to wait a long time for that to happen. Dan August has aired on television, even in the not very distant past. If you go on YouTube and look for it, there's a Get TV bug on it. I've never seen it air on Get TV, and I've had Get TV for a number of years, but it did air on Get TV in the somewhat recent past. It's not presently airing on TV, but if you do want to see Dan August in its entirety, not all of it is on YouTube, but you can buy the DVD set of the complete series of Dan August right now on Amazon for a cool $20. And really, that's a pittance to get all the Norman Fell and Burt Reynolds you could ever hope for. Serious Norman Fell. Not comedic mugging to the camera Norman Fell from the Ropers and from Three's Company. We're talking serious Norman Fell. You just don't get that nowadays.
Now, hold on a second, Mike. I just realized something. Burt Reynolds and Norman Fell were on an episode of the FBI, and it was the famous episode of the FBI that Quentin Tarantino replaced Burt Reynolds with Leonardo DiCaprio in Once Upon a Time in Hollywood in the opening sequence.
How about that? Nice little bit of movie history there.
Another little bit of history, because Burt Reynolds was almost not cast on this TV show. Quinn Martin wanted Christopher George to star in the show, but he had to pull out because he was previously committed to another series, The Immortal. He suggested Burt Reynolds.
Now, hold on a second, Chico. The Immortal, is that what they based the NES game out of?
No.
Oh.
This is a guy who has special blood, and everybody's out to get him.
Now, think about this if you're keeping score. On this podcast, we've made a reference to The Immortal, and we made a reference to Cheetah Men way back in the Man vs. Beast episode.
Cheetah Man, oh my. I was not expecting a Cheetah Man reference during Dan August. That's just amazing. Now I'm taking a look at The Immortal here. Okay. It had Ross Martin. I think that's like the only thing going for it. I see Ross Martin. That's it. I don't even know if Ross Martin was a regular character. Oh, actually, there's a couple other names on here that just caught my eye. Jessica Walter was on The Immortal. But also, another cast member in The Immortal is Paul Frees. Greg, you would appreciate this. Paul Frees was the voice of Boris Badenov in the original Rocky and Bullwinkle show.
Oh, that's terrific.
Kill Moose and Squirrel. That's great. I can seriously hear him saying about the main character, Kill Moose and Squirrel. You're some crazy schnook. We love our Rocky and Bullwinkle around here. What can we say?
So this show actually has a bit of a legacy, if you can believe it. According to an article from Get TV, Burt Reynolds was nominated for a Golden Globe, but production manager Howard Alston said that the editors assembled outtakes demonstrating how charming and funny Burt Reynolds was when he didn't think the cameras were rolling. Alston said, quote, Burt took that gag reel, he went on these talk shows, and he changed his whole career around. He had this whole personality change in front of the camera as a result. He became a motion picture actor on the basis of that gag reel, end quote.
So what can we say about Dan August? There were a lot of stars. Seriously, how long is this episode? Hour, 20 minutes, hour and a half? Maybe even longer? That's all the stars that were on this episode. It was loaded. And that's not even including Norman Fell and Burt Reynolds. This is jam-packed with stars. Maybe 10 p.m. wasn't a good time slot. Yeah, the competition was not favorable. Then it got moved, and that time slot was not favorable. And ultimately, Dan August, he just became a thing on TV. You can find us at our website, itwasathingontv.com, on Facebook at It Was a Thing on TV podcast, and elsewhere at It Was a Thing on TV. You can find us on any podcast player, and we're also on YouTube, where you can subscribe to our channel to keep up to date with our releases, including what's coming up next time. We're going back to the late 80s, and we're going to talk about one of the true popular cult classics in television history. What started off as a movie character in the UK, and not much later, a talk show host in the UK, came over to the United States and pitched a very popular product which failed and failed miserably. But he got a show out of it. What show are we talking about, and what character are we talking about? You'll find out right here on next Monday, the 18th. Right here it is a thing on TV.
Wow! Now hold on a second. On my YouTube recommendations, I have this Canon Club, and it just says burrito.
Now I want to burrito.
Can I have a burrito, please?
I'm surprised the burrito shop guy was like, "Sir, you're gonna have to pay for that burrito."
That's a waste of a perfectly good burrito.
Hey, thank heavens he didn't eat it, because we know he has a problem with cheese burritos. You know, I wish I saw this before now, because for my Halloween costume yesterday, I could have had a burrito there. I could have thrown the burrito on the ground.
Look at the description. I really want to eat this burrito from the food truck.
Just watched the episode on MeTV 2 nights ago. Hard to believe Cannon and Mannix are going on 50 plus years. They still hold up against anything on TV today. True.
Uploads like this make YouTube great. I am not kidding.
Also true.
He could still eat it while driving with the upper hand on the steering wheel, chasing them in his classic old car traffic. For the rest of his life, most of the day, Cannon didn't think about that. Frank Cannon would never do that to a pork chop.
Frank Cannon eating a burrito. Whatever you do, don't stand directly behind him.
Burritos, I love them. Could have at least taken it with him, wasting food. And what did the vendor think about what he did? Bad Cannon. Bad. Hey, he's a 300-pound man. What's a burrito going to do? He could have easily eaten it up. I remember the episode with Morton Sheen, and he had to chuck his burrito and slash taco due to some bad bikers led by Daniel J. Travanti. Great show. I bet he came back later and picked that burrito out of the trash. Cannon is a man that gets things done. Food can relate. He could have at least taken a bite for burrito.
Hold on, I'm adding a comment.
What?
Good thing Cannon didn't eat the burrito. He has a problem with cheese burritos. There we go. I added it. It's there.
It's part of the zeitgeist.
Let me just see. There it is. Good thing, Cannon.